Was it them or a flying monkey? It was nearly 3/4 of the way through their youngest daughter's lengthy hospitalization when John, briefly returning home to gather essentials and tend to other pressing chores, opened a letter that would stop him cold. Inside the envelope, from Blue Cross, was a notification that his daughter's health insurance coverage had been terminated. The letter outlined the termination and listed the remaining hospital balance, an astronomical sum, conservatively estimated for the purposes of this writing, at just under $1 million. John stood in disbelief. His hands trembled slightly as the numbers burned themselves into his vision. The air around him felt suddenly thinner. Panic in action, his immediate assumption was that the entire policy had been canceled due to a late payment, a reasonable concern during such an emotionally and logistically overwhelming time. Without hesitation, John acted. He instructed Angela to join him and go to the Blue Cross Payment Center, located near the hospital, and enroll their daughter under her policy instead. He personally covered the difference in premium. With a background in insurance law, John understood the strict regulatory window. Any policy could not be canceled within 30 days of non-payment, and coverage gaps could prove devastating. He also knew how difficult it would be to get the insurer to reverse such a decision, especially after significant claims had already been made. But something felt off. The account hadn't lapsed. There were no payment notices, no premium alerts, no correspondence indicating risk of cancellation, and the evasiveness from Blue Cross's call center only deepened his concern. The representative seemed hesitant, confused, almost guarded. John's break came through an unexpected connection. The president of the local Blue Cross chapter happened to be a member of a professional fraternity, to which John also belonged. Hoping that shared affiliation might foster cooperation, John penned a respectful letter on fraternity letterhead, outlining the urgency of the matter. The strategy worked. A few days later, he received a discreet phone call, not from the president, but from his executive secretary. She had taken the liberty of investigating the account herself. What she told John was chilling. "Mr. McDaniel, your policy wasn't canceled due to late payment. It's still active, but someone called our office and had your daughter removed from the policy." John was stunned. "Who?" he asked. "It was a woman. She had very specific information about your policy and personal information, enough to pass authentication." John requested the call recording, standard practice for quality assurance. His request was denied. "Why?" The secretary hesitated, then offered a possible explanation in carefully chosen words. "There's concern that if you recognize the voice, it might lead to consequences outside of our control." John knew exactly what that meant, but he never pushed further. He didn't demand legal action. He didn't unleash his attorney. His daughter still required intensive medical attention, homeschooling, and eventually a second surgery. Survival, not vengeance, became the priority. Blue Cross did reverse their position and honored all claims. They would not have if this discovery did not have merit. Was it flying monkey? Over time, as the fog of medical crisis began to lift, John reflected on what had likely happened. The specificity of the information provided to Blue Cross meant that the caller had either direct knowledge of John's private records or had been given the details by someone who did. That left two possible culprits. Angela, directly acting to sabotage him financially. A flying monkey, doing Angela's bidding without fully understanding the consequences. John had encountered this pattern before. Third parties being weaponized by a narcissist to carry out tasks that shield the narcissist from direct blame. If this was the case, the flying monkey, too, was a victim, fed a false narrative and enlisted to act on misaligned loyalty. He thought about the social circles Angela operated in, friends from work, neighbors who owed her favors, even extended family members who didn't have the full picture. Anyone could have made the call, convinced they were helping a mother under pressure. John chose not to pursue criminal charges, even though the impersonation could have easily warranted them. His reasoning was simple. What kind of guilt must someone already carry if they're willing to help sabotage a child's insurance coverage for someone else's control? Was this merely an act of emotional terrorism, designed to financially bury John at a moment of parental vulnerability? Or was it part of a deeper attempt to cover past betrayals, perhaps connected to earlier fidelity issues, as suggested in the chapter involving their daughter's first hospital stay? Either way, the implications were undeniable. Angela, or someone acting on her behalf, used confidential information to intentionally remove their sick child from health coverage, placing the family at catastrophic financial risk during a medical emergency. This event showcases some of the most dangerous hallmarks of narcissistic behavior. Financial sabotage disguised as clerical error, use of third-party enablers to maintain plausible deniability, a complete lack of empathy, even for one's own child. This wasn't just manipulation. It was calculated, premeditated, and executed in silence. Another perfect sleight of mind. A second hospital, a second chance, or so it seemed. The transfer to hospital number 2 had been a success. One of the oldest teaching hospitals in the world, it boasted state-of-the-art technology, a renowned pediatric surgical department, and, on a lighter note, perhaps the best hospital food court in the country, populated by local merchants and independent purveyors. Angela and John's daughter was quickly scheduled to meet with her new care team. The diagnosis remained unchanged. The damage caused by her weeks-long battle with ulcerative colitis was irreversible. Her large intestine and rectum would need to be removed. The surgery would leave her with a stoma and a colostomy bag, possibly a life-altering but life-saving intervention. The reality was sobering, but the professionalism and clarity of the new team inspired cautious optimism. Though relieved by the hospital's competence and professionalism, John was under no illusion. It was clear the staff at Hospital No. 1 had passed along not only the medical charts, but also the dynamics of the family situation, including the proof of custody and parental rights John had been forced to provide after Angela falsely claimed he had none. That shadow trailed him into these new hospital halls, clinging like smoke to his every step. But despite the record being corrected, the psychological warfare hadn't ended. John was still the scapegoat, the target of a long-standing narcissistic campaign, one that did not yield simply because the venue had changed. Angela resumed her routine almost immediately. Whispered phone calls just outside the room, portraying John as uninvolved or absent, when in fact he was only a few feet away. Her expressions of martyrdom resurfaced in subtle jabs and vague allusions. Medical personnel were once again manipulated with carefully staged impressions, and John, aware of how easily perception could be twisted, chose not to share the cramped parent's sleeping space this time, not out of bitterness, but self-preservation. Instead, he registered with the nursing station to be notified of all medical updates and overnight developments. He spent his nights in the hospital's expansive glass-walled lobby, curled into one of its oversized, cushioned armchairs overlooking the city. The occasional ambulance siren, or the quiet whir of a floor polisher, was a small price to pay for peace. On the eve of his daughter's major surgery, John was seated in a quiet visitor alcove near the elevators, just around the corner from the patient rooms. He was giving space to extended family who had reached the room's visitation limit. From behind the decorative half-wall, he overheard Angela walking her sister Marie to the elevator. Unaware that John was within earshot, Marie casually said, "You should say goodbye to John. I don't think he saw me leave." What followed was a verbal tirade that would have made hardened soldiers flinch. Angela exploded into a stream of unfiltered hatred, using every four-letter word in her arsenal, loudly and repeatedly. Her mildest insult? Asshole. The elevator finally arrived, and the doors closed on her venom. Once he assumed Marie had reached her car in the garage, John called her. "Hey, it's me, the asshole," he said dryly. Marie burst out laughing. She knew exactly what he meant. Angela had once targeted her too, during the early years of their marriage, and they had only recently reconciled following the death of their mother. That call, ironically, cemented their renewed connection. Surgery and spiritual solitude to surgery was long but successful. The attending surgeon, skilled and empathetic, communicated every detail with clarity and compassion. The clinical aspects of the procedure are not the focus here. That story belongs to the daughter herself. What matters in this narrative is how John once again chose to step back from the hostile circle surrounding him. Rather than sit in the waiting room beside relatives who had grown distant or cold, John made regular visits to the hospital chapel, where he quietly said a rosary and prayed for his daughter. He knew, no matter what he did, whether he sat beside them or sat with God, Angela would spin against him. So he chose peace. In solitude, he found strength. After the surgery, recovery was slow and emotionally difficult. To lift her spirits, John brought their beloved Australian shepherd, Lilac, for a surprise visit. The hospital staff, fully aware of the family dynamics by now, bent the rules, allowed the daughter outside in her wheelchair for a brief reunion beyond the same massive glass wall John had stared through so many lonely nights. The moment, simple, pure, and joyful, cut through months of anxiety like sunlight. His daughter's laughter rang out for the first time in weeks. As the discharge date neared, both parents were given detailed instruction on stoma care, adhesive options, and sterile handling procedures. John was present, engaged, and helpful, though it often seemed his participation was only selectively needed later. The notes he took, the questions he asked, all seemed to dissolve from memory when it came time to recall who did what. A classic narcissistic trait, known as discarding, later became evident. What didn't serve the narcissist narrative simply didn't exist in memory. Angela's tone had grown cordial again, calling John almost daily to ask for help, sounding grateful on the surface. But behind the scenes, the same tired telephone gossip resumed, spinning these offers of assistance into signs of John's inadequacy or absence. Angela unknowingly had her leaks. Even Lily, the family dog, was enlisted in the performance. Angela allowed the dog to stay at her home for emotional support, a generous gesture by Dad considering that the daughter wouldn't return to her father's home accommodations for months. John never criticized this. He knew the daughter needed her mother in that time. But the rules would later change when Dad was no longer deemed necessary. When his support had been no longer needed, the scapegoating resumed. The family dynamic in this scenario reveals an ongoing pattern of emotional manipulation masked as maternal devotion. Angela projected herself as the ever-present caregiver, while quietly invalidating and erasing John's presence, even when he was physically beside her. She curated the optics while controlling the story. Smearing psychological triangulation, false narratives, and selective memory became weapons of control. Even recovery itself became a stage for narcissistic performance. Love was leveraged. Help was repackaged as intrusion. And genuine care was overshadowed by a need to dominate the story. This wasn't about healing. It was about hierarchy, another perfect event of sleight of mind.